Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this session on the impact of vulnerable groups and support measures to alleviate the suffering. It's my pleasure today to be able to host this session and to facilitate the session amongst a group of researchers who have contributed greatly to our understanding of the pandemic and how it's impacted South African society. The pandemic exposed and broadened many vulnerabilities while also increasing several risk factors such as access to healthcare, water, food. Some of these livelihood issues were addressed during the first day of the winter school. Many of the risks were felt strongly by women, children, elderly, and disabled people, as well as refugees and migrants. Today we'll be sharing evidence based on the first 5 waves of NIDS-CRAM, and we'll be looking beyond that to additional sources of information that shed light on the experience of South Africa during this time. We want to ask questions such as what happened to unemployment and inequality and education. And we have a distinguished panel of speakers today that will in fact be able to shed light on these issues. I'd like to then call on our first speaker, Professor Murray Leibbrandt, to address us. Murray Leibbrandt is one of our distinguished professors at the University of Cape Town in the School of Economics. He is also the director of the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit. He holds the DSD NRF National Research Chair of Poverty and Inequality Research and joined ICE as a research fellow in 2012. Please welcome Murray Leibbrandt. And Murray, please go ahead. You have 10 minutes to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Riza. I'm not sure whether you can share my screen. See my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and you can maximize your slides.
Great. It should be maximized now. Good morning, everybody. It's a great privilege to be part of the winter school, and a special privilege to introduce this session on NIDS-CRAM to our winter school participants. My job is to give a broad brush introduction to NIDS-CRAM, and what makes that so pleasurable is that it represents a considerable achievement by the research community of this country in responding to a pressing need. And you people as the younger researchers in this country, there are resources for you to use, and hopefully there's some inspiration in what you hear in this session about our country and our responses of the social scientists. So I start with a quote from Lenin. Do you know who Lenin is? I hope so. I'm older than you are. Lenin said, there are decades where nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. And this just perfectly sums up the sense of February last year. COVID arrived. We were hearing about its arrival. The president was beginning to configure some policies, talking about lockdown, and the academic research community, social scientists, felt a call to action. What can we do in this moment of crisis for our country? And through the leadership, really, of Nick Spall, I'm putting my cursor on. I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor, but there he is. He looks quite young there. He's aged considerably over this period. But Nick Spall put out the word to the South African social science community that works with survey data, doing quantitative evaluation of policy, saying, what can we do? Surely we can respond to this. Don't we need a tracking survey that tells this country what the impact of this COVID pandemic is? And there was a wonderful response from the academic community in this country. It is one of our strengths in academia. I hope some of you are young researchers doing that sort of work. So there was a great response. This slide makes the steering committee look the biggest. That's really, it's inversely correlated to actual contribution in the project. But anyway, so the outcome of that was an intensive process of investigation of, okay, how can we actually do this tracking survey? And what came out then was the design and configuration of the NIDS-CRAM panel study. It's the largest non-medical study in South Africa at the moment that's tracked our country through COVID, looking at the socioeconomic impacts. It was run off the National Income Dynamics Study Survey. It used the basis of that. Government had invested in this country's information base through 5 waves of a national panel study, the National Income Dynamics Study. From 2008 to 2017, we'd run 5 waves, and I'm sure lots of you know about NIDS. But nonetheless, come 2017, it gave a very, very rich socioeconomic baseline, in a sense, the best we had in the country at the time, on which to found NIDS-CRAM. And so the NIDS-CRAM survey, permission was given by government to use the NIDS-CRAM Wave 5 sample and information as the basis for sampling the NIDS-CRAM survey. Obviously, it was a lockdown, so we had to do, it required telephonic surveys, drawn from about 7,000 of the individuals in NIDS. It couldn't do the households as well, because you only get 20 minutes if you're doing a telephonic survey. But anyway, an incredible adjustment from this country to run a telephonic survey by absolutely world-class standards. It's been spoken about all over the world as the exemplar, really, of this sort of survey. We now have, you'll be hearing results from 5 waves that have tracked this pandemic, tracked these 7,000 people through the pandemic. They told the story of South Africa, to the policy community. The data is available for you. So this is the end of my infomercial part of the presentation. It's all available. It's ready for your use as young researchers, and you'll see in the session now how it was used to inform government, to inform our country about the pandemic. Here we have a picture of the pandemic rolling through. We've got the COVID cases on a 7-day moving average running from March 2020 through to June 2021. We ran 5 waves of NIDS-CRAM over that time, collecting the data. You can see the public school closures. That reflects the lockdowns over this period as government implemented policies to cope and trying to balance the socioeconomic costs with the health need to lock down. And NIDS-CRAM was following this all the way through. You can see in orange, well, my colors aren't so great, brown or orange, I don't know what it looks like to you, the waves of NIDS-CRAM. Here, the first wave under the strict lockdown, and the second wave then in July, third wave, November, December, the fourth wave, fifth wave. So, NIDS-CRAM is following through. In the session, you'll hear a lot of detail about what we found, what these 7,000 individuals who then represent people, they weighted up to represent the South African population as best we can do it. And what story did they tell? I don't want to preempt any of the discussions coming up. I just want to flag a few key points. Obviously, this was a moment in which government made some emergency top-ups to our social grants and introduced the Social Relief of Distress grant. And so one of the key issues that NIDS-CRAM was trying to follow was the impact of this emergency relief. First, to measure the scale of the strict lockdown in April, 2020, but then to see what the impact of the grants would be. I leave it as a scene from a forthcoming attraction. You'll hear more about this later. There was an extensive grant rollout. Then NITS-CRAM picked up immediately the loss of jobs with the hard lockdown. It picked it up. Stats SA picked it up, and we followed it through the first half of the year. And then what happened in the second half of the year? How did the economy cope? The labour market is perhaps the best lens that NITS-CRAM has in looking at how the economy, this balance between our health and our economy. And NITS-CRAM as a panel data set is perfectly configured to work out how people responding in terms of labour market behaviour, who's losing jobs, who's managing to regain jobs, who's being re-employed, is the labour market restructuring, are new people getting jobs rather than old people being rehired? These are key issues, and you'll hear more.
Murray, you got 1 more minute.
Thank you. Perfect, Reza. Because I'm just trying to whet your appetite for the session that's coming and engage with you in the context of this winter school, right? We're pulling you in as part of a community that's trying to make a contribution here. In terms of the outcomes that NITS-CRAM has to measure the impact on people, on citizens, it's a panel of individuals. The hunger variable is perhaps the key one. NITS-CRAM is a bit weak because we only had 20 minutes on usual money metric, poverty and inequality and its changes. You need to ask lots of survey questions for that. But still, there's some hunger questions that showed a very daunting picture in NITS-CRAM. You can see hunger spiking in April 2020. Even by historical standards, there's a very good paper by Sir Fas van der Berg that shows by historical standards that's a huge spike. And it doesn't matter which question you use, it spikes. Then it declines in response to the grants, or you'll hear more about that, but it's still extremely high. And so the hunger figures really were a reality check for our country about the impact of the pandemic on people. There are also mental health questions. We all know that people have taken immense strain in coping with the pandemic. And there are mental health questions in 3 of the waves that show you'll see a rise in incidence of depression, a depressive mood. And that's another outcome that tells us the texture. It's what people talk about. It's what people say on the radio. But the mandate of us as researchers was to try and evaluate government policies and to evaluate how households and individuals were coping with the pandemic. I'll stop there, Reza. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Murray. And an excellent quote by Lenin, as well as some great slides about the impact using NITS-CRAM. I'd now like to welcome Haroon Borat to the presentation stage. Haroon is a professor of economics, also one of the very distinguished professors at the University of Cape Town. He's also director of the Development Policy Research Unit, and his research interests cover labor economics, poverty and income distribution. He's co-authored and co-edited a number of books on labor market and poverty issues in Africa. Haroon has also published more than 200 academic journal articles, book chapters and working papers by 2021, and was also nominated to be on the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. Haroon, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Reza. Just going to share my screen. Okay, tell me if you can see it.
We can see it now, Haroon, and you can maximize your slides.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Thanks very much. I've been given 10 minutes to sort of do a whistle-stop tour of thinking about the sort of economics of COVID, what I've called early impressions. I'll really try and do 3 big things. One is look at the labor market outcomes, at least dig a little bit deeper beyond the aggregate numbers in terms of our early impressions. Then very briefly, but probably not too much time, on the stimulus package. I just want to focus a little bit on making us realize how positive and strong the response has been from the president with respect to a COVID-19 stimulus package. And then if there's time, just to reflect a little bit about the macro dynamics. Murray showed this graph earlier. I think it's interesting because, over the last year, as all of us have done these presentations, you keep on updating this graph, and this graph is now gone from a first wave to a second, and now we're at a third wave. What you'll see is that we look fairly similar in sort of daily infections relative to other middle-income countries, and certainly lower than, say, the UK. I think the shift has now been, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but the shift has now gone from waves, if you like, rather towards the rollout of the vaccination program and the challenges there. And I think the role that the private sector is playing is coming under scrutiny. More in terms of home, intellectually or analytically, you remember this, right? So we had a national treasury pre-COVID projection of growth at 0.9%. And then, of course, with COVID, the projection, which was actually the closest, I think, to what we eventually got, was the National Treasury saying a minus 7.2 contraction. We ended up at 7%. The strong bounce back, though, averages between 2 and 5% across the different macro models. The only thing I'll say there, I guess, because we have some students in the audience, is ask the question about the macro models. What are the assumptions about the intensity and the length of the lockdowns in these different models? Already, I think we're probably on the low end in terms of these 2021 projections, given what's happened in terms of resource prices. Here's the really important sort of first, sorry, I'm getting SMSs from the organizers while I'm presenting. I don't know how to switch my camera on, so while I'm talking, because I'm in full view. What we're seeing in terms of employment shifts is, I've got here a comparison across, let me just get the laser pointer. So I've taken the 2020 figures, which is the solid line, 2019 figures pre-COVID, and then I've looked at the job shifts across the 4 quarters for 2021, for 2020. The really important point is the non-linear nature of employment shifts, and we always forget about this. There was this massive thing about the number of jobs lost. Well, that was the initial shock. So the initial shock was about 2.2 million jobs lost, but then there has been a recovery. So the net job loss, that's the one we're really interested in, has been about 1.4 million jobs. To put it in perspective, the Great Recession, we saw about 900,000 jobs lost. So effectively, we're seeing about a decrease of 8% across the 4 quarters for 2020. How large and strong the recovery will be depends a lot on our growth figures, right? So if we're looking at the 2.6%, that's what we've got to be focusing on. One of the things that was unusual for us as labor economists to look at, because it was a pandemic-induced shock, not a sort of financial crisis, if you like, anything like that, is what happened to this share of workers reporting that they worked 0 hours. So there was this massive spike from an equilibrium sort of I think it was 2-3% of workers saying they worked 0 hours in 2019, and it stayed constant across the quarters. It spikes to about 15%, but then normalizes down to the 4th quarter. That's an interesting thing about how employers responded, saying to workers, go home, right, and stop working. You will retain your jobs, but stop working. And that was an interesting sort of figure to keep in mind in terms of the peculiarity of the pandemic. We looked at wages. I should have said this is all of the QLFS data. You looked at wages across the percentiles. What's really interesting is that the largest reduction, thankfully, was for higher earning wages, higher earning workers. So for the 90th percentile and the 75th percentile, you see a 15 and 17% reduction in wages post-COVID. So the red dotted line is when we're looking at the pandemic striking. Very little shift or relatively lower shifts for workers from the median down. One of the things we are interested in is, of course, what's happened to workers across the distribution in terms of job losses. So the take-home point here is that effectively job losses were most severe for workers in lower quintile households. So if you look at, so we've linked workers to the households they live in. So the poorest 20% of households see a larger reduction in employment relative to quintile 2, quintile 3, and so on, right? So put the two together, effectively what we have is larger job losses for poorer household workers and larger wage reductions for higher earning wages. So the job loss hit comes for the more vulnerable and the wage hit for those at the top end. Inequality, the Gini is not a great measure. As we know, it's sort of middle distribution heavy. But what you do see early evidence across the quarters is that the Gini pops up sharply from second quarter of 2020 and then comes down again slightly. I think the Gini, wage Gini and analytics needs to be combined with household income because you've got job losses happening. So zero earners stack up as well as wage shifts happening. So there are all sorts of dynamics going on, making it slightly hard to predict exactly which way inequality is moved. Now I want to turn to job losses in a little bit more detail. Notice here I've taken second quarter annualized. So I've looked at second quarter 2020 against second quarter 2019. And I've tried to look at job losses across sectors and skills. Take-home point is that 67% of job losses emanated from tertiary sectors, 30% from the secondary sectors. Effectively, though, the number to focus on is the last column, and look at that compared to the second last column. The higher that number, it means the disproportionate share of job losses come from that particular sector. Effectively, what we're seeing is a disproportionate share of the job losses that we observe over this time period have actually come from the secondary sectors, particularly manufacturing and construction. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. In addition, a large number, and I'll come back to this, of domestic workers lost their jobs, as well as a disproportionate share of semi-skilled workers and low-skilled workers.
Haroon, you're out of time. You want to just wrap up?
Sorry, I have 8 minutes on my thing. Do I have 2 minutes left?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
So if I look at employment shifts by individual characteristics, what you tend to find is young African males dominate job losses, right? Which is not surprising. We didn't find a gender effect in terms of these results for this time period, but what we do see is a large share of job losses amongst young workers, right? And I think that's a really big result. Almost no job losses in the public sector and no job losses amongst union workers. So I'm going to skip a lot of slides, but the one thing to keep in mind is there's been a lot of media coverage about the fact that the stimulus package from South Africa has been underwhelming and so on. This evidence on the right is very, very clear, right? We presented this to the president through the Gtac, is that we are, if you look at the IMF data, both above and below line expenditure as a percentage of GDP, much, much higher than other developing countries, more than Canada, for example, South Korea, Brazil, and so on. So in fact, our response has been large in comparative terms, and in particular, which I won't focus on, the rest of the presentations today, I think, will take us to the 50 billion on social assistance and look at some of the effects. So let me skip all of this and just talk about the macro story, which is basically my last slide. The thing to keep in mind is that the resource revenues have seen a decline in our deficit from the projected 16%, but we're still faced with a deficit of 9%, deficit to GDP ratio of 9%. And I think one of the things government's got to be thinking about is how to look at social assistance within the context of high deficits. I've put up some policy responses there, but happy to share the slides. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Haroon. And please, everyone, do not hesitate to put questions in the Q&A. We'll also have a poll at the end of the session. So you're welcome to engage there, and there'll be some time at the end for questions as well. I'd now like to welcome Gabriel Sanchez to the stage. Gabriel is, in fact, a labor economist who's worked extensively at both the University of Cape Town in Saddle, as well as at WITS in the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And his research focuses on employment dynamics of different groups, and he's here to shed some of the findings of his research using the NIDS-CRAM survey. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you, Riza. I'll just share my screen. Okay, just to confirm that you are looking at my slide.
Yes, we can see them. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I'll be speaking about age and employment in COVID-era South Africa. This is based on research done by myself, Mari Liebrandt, and Vimal Ranchard, and it was part of the NIDS-CRAM policy papers from waves 2 through to wave 5. So NIDS-CRAM, as Mari introduced, it tells us about individuals' employment in 6 months: February, April, June, and October 2020, and January and March 2021. This means that we have a measure of people's employment during several different stages of lockdown and several different stages of the pandemic, covering the first and second waves of infections. So to compare outcomes across age groups, we distinguish between youth aged 18 to 24, prime age adults aged 25 to 39, middle age adults aged 40 to 54, and older adults aged 55 to 64. We think that youth and older adults are likely to be in terms of potential labor market restructuring and changes in labor force participation. These two groups at opposite ends of the age spectrum may have had their decision-making surrounding studying versus working, and labor market withdrawal affected by the crisis at both ends. And firms may also have used the lockdown as an opportunity for restructuring and the replacement of older workers by younger workers who are generally cheaper to employ. And we know from pre-COVID research that youth suffer especially high unemployment and volatile employment. And it's of interest what happened to this in the context of a huge exogenous shock. And also that old adults have gradually declining labor force participation rates after the age of 45, which plays into early retirement decisions. So initially, this is a plot of, we have the percentage employed on the y-axis, and then we have all of the months covered by NIDS-CRAM on the x-axis. Now, the employment to population ratio, which is just the percentage employed within any of the groups. This shows you very clearly how NIDS-CRAM tracks the drastic employment loss from February to June, and then, as shown in NIDS-CRAM, a substantial employment recovery between June and October, and then also the temporary employment dip with the second wave in January, and then recovery in March 2021. So I'll focus now on comparing the employment to population ratio in February 2020, which gives us a pre-pandemic measure of employment among each of these groups, and in March 2021, which gives us a measure of what people's employment was like 1 year into the pandemic and how it differed relative to the pre-pandemic levels. So youth experienced the largest employment to population ratio increase between February 2020 and March 2021, increasing from 32.5% to 35%, whereas old adults experienced the largest decrease from 45% to 41%. The other two groups, the prime age and middle age adults, experienced more small changes, with middle-aged adults rising marginally from 68 to 69% in the period, and prime-age adults declining marginally from 62.5% to 61%. So this gives us a basic idea of the cross-sectional changes over time for each of these 4 age groups. But we also know that just because the employment to population ratio is similar at 2 points, that does not mean that the same people are employed. And we want to go beyond this to look at the employment dynamics underlying this. So this is a transition matrix between February 2020 and March 2021. And basically you have February 2020 employment status here divided into employed and non-employed, and your sample for each. And then you have the proportion of each group who were in each state in March 2021. And note that these sum to 100. So basically this tells us that it looks like there's quite a lot of movement, quite a lot of volatility in the labor market, with around 77% of the February 2020 employed remaining employed 1 year later, and around 30% of the non-employed finding employment in March 2021. So, but this begs the question, high relative to what? And you can only really make that statement if you're comparing it or benchmarking it towards some sort of pre-COVID measure. So very briefly, we compare it to employment status transitions between Q2 of 1 year and Q1 of the following year, trying to match the period as closely as possible, in the period between 2010 and 2014. And this is based on panels constructed from the quarterly labor force survey. So very briefly, you can see that the 77% employment retention rate in NISCRAM is far lower than the 89% average observed in this historical period. And similarly, the around 30% employment finding rate in NISCRAM is much, much higher than the typical job finding observed among different groups of the non-employed. And then beyond looking at employment transitions between these two endpoints, we can also look at how many of these people who remained in a stable state had temporary transitions in the interim. And among this group who were employed in both periods, 32% lost their job between February 2020 and March 2021. Among this group who went into the crisis non-employed and were still non-employed in March 2021, 24% had found employment at some point in between. So this tells us that on top of many people changing state between the periods, there was a very large degree of people who had these temporary transitions in and out. In some, it looks like a labor market which was already known to be characterized by high churning became much more volatile in the face of the COVID pandemic. So we can also show these same transition matrices, but divided into our 4 age groups rather than for all working age adults. And just briefly, if you look at job finding, it was high across age groups, but especially high for middle-aged adults and for youth when benchmarked against historical job finding rates. So we can also examine industry and occupation data to see what kinds of economic shifts seem to be associated with the age dynamics that we have observed. And preliminary findings from our Wave 5 paper revealed that from June onwards, the industries with the most notable increases in employment totals were the community, social and personal services and wholesale and retail trade industries. And interestingly, this increase in the community, social and personal services sector is mirrored in the QLFS from Q2 onwards. We also found that these industries also displayed high or increasing youth intensity of employment, which means the share of all people employed who are youth, potentially explaining part of the positive youth outcomes observed in NISCRAM. So to summarize, we've shown that all age groups were affected by the employment disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic and experienced increases in their employment volatility relative to historical rates. However, there was also some heterogeneity in age groups' outcomes, with exceptional job finding observed among youth and the highest increase in employment to population ratio, perhaps surprisingly, and the largest decrease in employment observed among older adults. As with any research, these findings have limitations and caveats. The changes over time in percentages employed within age groups are not statistically significant, which means that the findings remain indicative. We do not distinguish between different forms of employment or non-employment. So within employment, we don't distinguish between the formally and informally employed, and that will be touched on in the next talk. But we also don't distinguish between active employment and furloughing, which was a big part of the crisis, especially in the early lockdown. And then in terms of non-employment, we don't distinguish between people who were previously unemployed and excluded from the job market versus those who may have just been in education or otherwise inactive. There are also doubts about the extent to which NISCRAM is representative of national trends and recovery. So I'm sure you'll all have noticed that there's quite a discrepancy in terms of the employment recovery shown in NISCRAM, as I've shown here, and the QLFS as shown in Haroon's talk previously. especially in the recovery from Q2 onwards. Further, the positive youth outcomes observed here aren't mirrored in the QLFS, where labor absorption of youth is stagnant or falling over the period. This hasn't really been reconciled yet, as of course there's uncertainty around both surveys, with the QLFS also changing to a different mode of data collection and becoming a panel suddenly at the beginning of 2020. So finally, just for all of the students in attendance, I think this research provides an example of the kinds of simple but meaningful descriptive research that can be done using panel or longitudinal data. You can look at cross-sectional proportions, like the proportion employed, for your groups of interest and contrast them over time. And you can look at the employment dynamics underlying these changes using transition matrices or transition trees to look at whether the same people are responsible for the employment rates that you're seeing over time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gabe. A wonderful example of what's possible to do longitudinally with the panel data set, and some great findings, thought-provoking, especially around the question of youth employment and the increase we saw in NIDS-CRAM relative to the QLFS. I'd now like to welcome to the stage Professor Miracle Ben-Hura. Miracle is at the Economics Department at the University of Witwatersrand. Her research interests are in applied microeconomics, development and labor economics, with a special focus on gender, education, poverty, and inequality. Miracle, please go ahead.
Good evening, good morning, Riza, and good morning to our students. So I'm talking here about the impact of COVID-19 on the informal sector.
Thanks, Miracle. We can see your slide.
Okay. So I start by giving a broad definition of the informal economy. So the informal economy is a diversified set of economic activities, enterprises, jobs, and workers that are not regulated or protected by the state. This concept originally applied to self-employment in small unregistered enterprises, but it has been expanded to include wage employment in unprotected jobs. So across the globe, the informal economy employs about 61.2% of all workers, and this applies to 90% of workers in developing countries. Also, among the informal workers, the majority are self-employed. For example, this applies to 79% of informal workers in developing countries. And these are self-employed individuals create their own economic opportunities under precarious conditions. For instance, they lack economic rights and face bribes or evictions by local authorities. Also, in South Africa, the informal economy employs about a third of the country's workforce, which is small by developing country standards. Now, looking at COVID-19 and informal employment, the COVID-19 pandemic, we all know that is the worst global crisis since World War II, and its containment measures have caused unprecedented disruption on economies and labor markets. So during the first quarter of 2020, many countries imposed stringent lockdown regulations, which stopped most economic activities and transmitted a non-ignorable demand and supply shock to the economy. This led to a deterioration in labor market outcomes and opportunities. But we find that most of the vulnerable workers in South Africa and the world over participate in the informal rather than the formal economy. As an example, during the first month of the crisis, earnings of about 1.6 billion informal workers declined by 60% globally, and this applied to an 80% decline in Africa. So the part of the reason is because informal workers are in vulnerable jobs, which are characterized by precarious working conditions. and they receive day-to-day earnings. And also the jobs have an absence of legal and social protections. As a result, any break in economic activity has an instantaneous effect on earnings and employment. So a few studies have been conducted to evaluate the effect of stringent lockdown regulation on labor market outcomes of informal workers. As a starting point, we've got Rogan and Skinner, who analyzed the change in labor market outcomes of informal workers, comparing the pre-pandemic period, that is in February 2020, and the first in level 5 lockdown period, which was in April. So they showed here that informal workers in South Africa were affected by the global crisis more than their formal counterparts. For instance, 31% of informal workers who retained their livelihoods during lockdown level 5 were locked out of employment in April, compared to 26% of those in formal employment. And also, among those who were employed informally in February and April, women in the informal sector saw a 49% decrease in typical hours worked in April, compared to a 25% decrease for men. Furthermore, we find that our average earnings decreased by 27%, while typical earnings for self-employed individuals decreased by 60%. So the devastating effects of COVID-19 containment measures on informal workers were just not unique to South Africa, but they were also confirmed in other developing countries, such as India, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Senegal. Here we find that because of that, the government are supposed to have put in place strategies to make informal workers visible to social support during times of crisis. So this is just a lesson, not just for the global pandemic here, but for any crisis that may lead to similar conditions as the stringent lockdown. Now, given the evidence from moving pre-pandemic to the first hard lockdown, we proceeded to investigate if there were any recovery in outcomes as the lockdown proceeded. So we had to analyze differences between formal and informal workers' outcomes during the pandemic. The study explored changes in wages and hours worked of formal and informal workers between April, which is lockdown level 5, and June, lockdown level 3. And we employed a difference in difference estimator and data from the two waves of needs claim. Yet the results showed that there was a wage decrease of the same order for both formal and informal workers. So we didn't see a recovery in wages here across sectors. And also, when we looked at subgroups of workers, evidence showed that wages decreased more for men and urban workers who were informally employed compared to their formal sector counterparts. And given that there were other effects on workers during the pandemic, we also proceeded to look at the effects of the global pandemic on mental health of formal and informal workers. So the COVID-19 containment measures have worsened the burden of depression among vulnerable groups in society. When viewed from the lens of labor markets in developing countries, it suggests that informal workers were exposed to a higher risk of depression than formal workers. And we also know that typical informal work is associated with stressful conditions that can cause mental disorders. And on top of that, informal workers were disproportionately affected by additional stressors from the stringent lockdown during the first quarter of 2020. So this could have amplified their mental health burden. As a result, we examined differences in depressive symptoms between informal and formal workers during the COVID-19 lockdown period. And our focus was on June to October 2020, which was characterized by easing of lockdown regulations from level 3 to level 1.
Miracle, you've
And the
got about
analysis, okay, the analysis here used data from NITS-CREM Wave 2 and Wave 3 and fixed effects and logit regressions. The results show that there were no statistically significant differences between informal and formal workers' mental health over this period. And workers living in urban areas and households suffering from hunger had a higher risk of experiencing depressive symptoms. So based on our results, we recommend for government strategies that curb the rise in depressive symptoms among workers. And also government can consider allocating resources to mental health and psychosocial support as an integral component of national recovery plans. So the broad conclusion here is that on the basis of our results, we only managed to find that the hard lockdown had greater devastating effects on informal workers. But when it comes to recovery, the results present weak evidence that either sector recovered better than the other. As a result, we call for broad government intervention measures to cushion all workers, regardless of sector, given that there is no strong sectoral differences. So here we can say that the defense mechanism of formal sector workers was caught off guard by the global pandemic, such that everyone had same exposure. Now, for the students, the take-home message from here could be to keep on tracking the recovery rates of formal and informal workers as the pandemic is progressing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Miracle. And I think these are absolutely crucial findings that NIDS-CRAM can provide a very powerful insight on. The mental health dimension of this pandemic has been devastating. So thanks for that wonderful presentation. I'd now like to welcome Najwa Indries to the stage to speak. Najwa, she heads up the Program Management Office of the South African National Treasury's 9 billion Rand Jobs Fund. The Jobs Fund, launched in 2011, operates as a challenge fund. Public money is used to co-finance projects with public, private, and non-governmental organizations through a competitive grant process. And I'm very much looking forward to what Najwa has to say. Please go ahead, Najwa.
Thank you, Riza, and good morning to everybody. Just to say that I have asked Mary to put my slides up, and so she will navigate that part of it for me. I also have a poll question that I prepared. And so, yes, thank you very much for this morning. So the theme of our deliberations for the past day and a half has been about public policy responses to COVID-19. My brief inputs takes us from the policy realm to the coalface. I will start with a brief introduction to the Jobs Fund, located within the range of government interventions that is currently existing. I will also make a few statements about the power of a challenge fund as a flexible financing mechanism. And thereafter, I will talk briefly about how the Jobs Fund responded to the lockdown. So I hope that in respect of our audience and as students of public economics, that you would find something interesting in what I have to say. Unfortunately, you don't have thumbs down emoji, so I'm just going to go right at it, okay? So on slide 2, I talk about our mandate. So in the context of persistent high levels of unemployment, the Jobs Fund was established to catalyze innovative solutions for employment creation. Government sent a strong signal to the market, and that is that it wanted to partner and share risk in identifying competitive interventions that would address key barriers to employment. It was willing to do this through a matching grant facility, and it envisaged that it would be able to deepen its reach through partnering with intermediaries who had the requisite track record, network, and technical abilities. So this is just government again saying, we know that we cannot do it on our own, and we need to look for partners, and we need to look for people who have a good track record and who will enable us to extend our reach deeper. The fund would then issue open call for proposals, and we would make funding available through 4 funding windows that really was focused at addressing both demand and supply side barriers in the labor market, and we would accept applications across all economic sectors. What we were looking for and the criteria against which we assessed these projects and applications was innovation, value for money, sustainability, systemic change. And in addition, applications would, of course, be considered more favorably if they had a specific focus on youth and women. As Riza had said, we were capitalized with 9 billion, and the program is located within the National Treasury. Slide 3. I now try to just reflect on the slide the range of interventions that government has on offer. It is important to note, however, that the fund complemented other government interventions, which range from social grants to initiatives that tackled structural causes of unemployment. The fund differed from other grant-making initiatives in that its focus was on facilitating the creation of sustainable jobs, so a little bit more than just short-term job opportunities. In addition, the fund created the space for experimentation and the testing of different employment models before going into large-scale rollout, thereby better managing the risk and promoting value for money in government. Again, a bit of a different approach to just what we normally have in government, where we roll out mass programs without spending a little time in testing. To this end, the fund had also implemented a rigorous monitoring and evaluation framework to support evidence-based policymaking. We have posted in the virtual exhibition space the result of some of the project evaluations. So slide 4, why a challenge fund? Broadly, the objective of a challenge fund is to provide the smallest possible financial contribution to a socially worthwhile project consistent with making it less risky and more financially sustainable to the promoter. Challenge Fund development financing model was first piloted in the UK as an alternative methodology for development assistance. The premise behind the funding mechanism was to attract and leverage substantial private sector investment and expertise that would assist government in solving social and developmental challenges. This mechanism also has the potential, of course, to exponentially increase the pool of funds available to stimulate the economy and create jobs. Given its flexibility as a funding mechanism, its ability to leverage private sector and other resources, it can be used to implement initiatives beyond just job creation. For example, it can be used as a funding instrument to stimulate better health outcomes, to improve education outcomes, and also to find solutions to advance emerging farmers. South Africa's fiscal constraints, challenge funding offers a viable solution in achieving government's development mandate. Co-investment, transparency, competition, and collaboration are key defining criteria of challenge funds. I've spoken about cost-effective and valid solutions to complex development issues accessed from the market. So government is saying, yes, come on board. We don't have all the answers, but we do this through a competitive process. You crowd in other resources, which of course results in the optimization of value for money. It also allows us to improve implementation capability while scaling interventions for a given level of public spend. The challenge fund mechanism also encourages investment innovation, given that solutions to long-standing social issues can only be achieved by doing things differently. It facilitates active engagement with stakeholders without creating market distortions. And its focus on desired outcomes without prescribing the means of achieving them thus creating a collaborative win-win opportunity. Slide 5. A few of our performance stats. The Jobs Fund has demonstrated that the Challenge Fund instruments relevance within the South African context by, firstly, catalyzing innovative, cost-effective job creation models across the economic spectrum. We have more than 146 partners, more than 200,000 jobs that have been created. I think what would be of special interest is that against 5.7 billion that we disbursed to these projects already, we've been able to leverage another 11.4 billion in matched funding from the market, that is from our project partners. We've also been able to create these jobs at a competitive grant cost of 20,000 Rand. So when the country went into lockdown in March 2020, the Jobs Fund immediately engaged all its project partners, and we listened to what they said about how they thought they would be impacted and the kind of support that they would require. We are all aware of how government responded at a national level, and we know that despite the good intent, the support was not always reaching the intended market segment. So I'm going to skip slides 7 and 8 because this just identifies a few of government's responses, and you're all aware of it. Previous speakers have spoken about that. To slide 9 then. So after listening to our partners and recognizing that funds needed to flow to those most in need, and of course the importance for us as well of securing our investments, we adjusted our decision-making processes in order to expedite the flow of funds. Our support focused on augmenting our partners and beneficiaries' working capital requirements. We focused on de-risking investment by traditional banking sources of finance into job creation projects because many of our partners had raised funds from traditional banking sources. We also focused on supporting ongoing skills development for youth and SMMEs and farmers, as well as supporting project partners and beneficiaries to comply with their existing loan repayment obligations. To slide 10, some of the results that we achieved. The primary beneficiaries of our intervention were youth, women, micro-enterprises, and smallholder farmers. More than 9,000 jobs were saved in this process. More than 3,000 individuals were reskilled or retrained, which enabled them to take up new opportunities. More than 600 youth were reached and were provided with support. We've heard about the health impact of COVID. We've heard about the assistance that young people need to transition from education. And so through this process, in one of our partners, the Harambee Employment Accelerator, more than 600,000 youth were reached. More than 30,000 enterprises were supported, and more than 200 million in funding was dispersed. So in addition, though, to the jobs saved, our partners also continued to create jobs, and more than 15,000 jobs were created in this period. However, what we are able to do was to experiment with a range of job creation models, including blended funding mechanisms, creating inclusive value chains, demand-led training and placement programs, loan guarantees, amongst others. The slides that you will receive, I provide more detail. Key success factors. In reflecting on this, I think our ability to working with intermediaries and sector experts had enabled us to rapidly roll out support. Our willingness to think differently about risk assurance when supporting vulnerable sectors, including the formal sector. Our willingness to change our operating procedures so that we could have funds flow more rapidly to those most in need. And the quality of our partnerships that we had developed, our willingness for risk sharing, and common intent to build a more inclusive economy were some of the things that really assisted us in this period. In conclusion, from policy to practice, as future policymakers, I hope then that when confronted with the challenge of making allocative decisions, you appreciate the importance of creating space for experimentation, innovation, and evidence-based policymaking amidst ongoing crises. That in the context of disaster and the need for developing appropriate responses, you have to balance your immediate response to the crisis while at the same time keeping your eye on the future and create space for innovation, experimentation, to find solutions to what may appear as intractable social challenges. That in the context of severe fiscal constraints, appropriately designed funding instruments can crowd in additional funding sources that can be directed at achieving greater social impact. And finally, in the context of national disaster, collaborate and find partners that work in niche areas that have the ability to build ecosystems of support, and it can crowd in further investment and support for government and the country at large. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Najwa, for a wonderful presentation on the Jobs Fund. I think what's particularly innovative there is the model that brings in public-private partnerships. One of the fantastic things that we've seen as a community living in South Africa in response to COVID has been how different agents have come together to assist one another to try and cope with the difficulty and with the shocks. I think the Solidarity Fund was initially one such example. The Jobs Fund is another, which has also had to adapt to COVID. The proposed Innovation Fund in the National Treasury last year was also something quite innovative, but it hasn't yet got off the ground to the same extent. And I think what we're looking to do as a country is to try and develop some of these policy responses that can fundamentally take us out of the pandemic in a positive way. I'm very thankful to all the presenters for staying to a very strict time limit. I've tried to do that specifically to enable questions. We now have 10 to 15 minutes available for those questions. So please go ahead and ask them. There have been some questions in the Q&A as well, and I would like to encourage all of the presenters to respond directly inside of the Q&A so that the questions that have been asked are also addressed there. And then finally, before I open the floor then to raised hands, there is the poll that has been put up. Please do rate our session. We would really value the feedback. So without further ado, are there any raised hands, questions to any of the presenters? They're all waiting for these questions. Okay. I don't see any at this point. There have been a few comments in the chat as well. And I know that all of the presenters would also be happy to take email questions after their presentations if you have specific questions to direct to them. In the meantime, what I am going to do is I'm going to actually ask Harun to just come back on, because I had previously sort of shortened his presentation prematurely, and I thought what he was getting to was actually quite a fascinating set of slides on the response. Harun, do you perhaps want to just talk to that last part of your presentation again if you're still online?
Sure, Riza, I am. Thanks. That's very kind of you. Did you say the last, the policy slides?
Yes.
Okay, so let me. Can you see that?
It's coming online. Yes, we see it now.
Okay. So thanks for that, Riza. So I guess I was trying to start a policy discussion here. I mean, my sense was that, and it's known to this audience very well, if you go through the Q&A, you see the four broad, let's call it relief programs from government, I mean, excluding the housing, water and sanitation, but all of that's included, of course, in how we think about our response. My suggestion was, and it's more for debate, have we, should we be thinking about moving from support to households towards firms, and again, let me be very clear, think micro enterprises, think survivalist enterprises. And here I'll put some policy options down here, expanding and deepening the wage subsidy to firms. To some extent, the president's announced a few of these already. The TERS extension that we got, it's almost a drip feeding towards lockdown damaged sectors. Whereas I think, if you think of the hospitality industry and, the clear sectors that are affected, you could easily go for a 1 year extension rather than the drip feed of every 3 months and so on. I've been a little bit controversial here and said, what about a moratorium on specific pieces of regulation, not just labor regulation, that we think could be damaging to employment? Just a moratorium, but that the social partners discuss. And then the last two are the bigger ones. I think we need to involve the private sector like Harambee and others far more intensively around employment search and employment placement. And then my current bugbear is the notion that we view the informal sector as instead of the first order of employment, rather viewed as a sort of marginal last order of employment. I'll stop there, Riza, and just add sort of one last comment is that, let me switch my camera on. Often we view, so we talk about very high unemployment rates, and we never couple it with the comparative statistic, which is one of the lowest rates of informality in the developing world. And that then sparks the question about, do we have a policy reform package that's targeted at absorbing the informal sector into employment? Just one quick example that maybe next panel can pick up on. We're considering, we have the COVID grant, 350 Rand a month. It costs a hawker 1,000 Rand a year, or 1,500 Rand a year, to buy a registration for his or her business, right? A license, a hawker's license. Why don't we subsidize that? That's subsidizing the cost of starting a business, right? And that's that little trick of moving away from households towards firms. Anyway, let me stop there, but thanks for allowing me.
Thanks, Arun. And it's precisely that point that I wanted to pick up on, because I wanted Miracle also perhaps to give the opportunity just to talk a little bit to some of those support measures for micro enterprises. And I do, so Miracle, please do feel and do come in on this. Partly the sense for me also, and I think for much of the research community, has been that there hasn't been concerted support for firms in the same way as households. And that's very, very understandable. Targeting can sometimes be much tougher. But I did want to ask Miracle also to come in just on that point and talk about a little bit on these micro firms and informality. Are there support mechanisms that you're aware of, Miracle, perhaps that have been implemented in other parts of the world that might be relevant here? And Miracle, once you respond, I'll go to some of the raised hands. But just in response to Harun's comment, please go ahead and answer.
Thanks, Riza. I was just thinking that there's need for measures which can make informal enterprises or micro enterprises to thrive. And given that they are linked to the formal enterprises, there's need for kind of support across the value chain, such that there can be a network or a linkage between the small firms and the established firms, such that they also have market linkages for inputs and also for their output. Because at the moment, I don't think there's a lot of that kind of support. So that's one measure that I can think about.
Thanks, Miracle. And again, yes, I think where we're at now is about finding these solutions to the crisis for firms, since they've been so hard hit. And of course, under those circumstances, we also face the fact that the conditions for investing in South Africa are also precarious, not just in South Africa, but all around the world. So we've seen gross domestic fixed investment reduce all over South Africa and all over the world. And we've also seen quite a strong level of fear associated with potential investments, given the fact that there's still what can often be termed as draconian sort of lockdown regulations, sometimes prohibiting trade and operating hours. So I just wanted to focus back then on Najwa and ask Najwa, perhaps, do you just want to talk a little bit about some concrete examples of how the Jobs Fund has facilitated investment during this time, if there are any examples that come to mind?
Yes, thank you, Riza. So, in respect of investments, I spoke about the Harambee, Youth Employment Accelerator. What During this period, of course, we all understood, and the data that has been shared with us, that youth were disproportionately affected by the lockdown. We also knew that in addition to the desire to work, youth were also confronted with psychosocial issues. So by supporting the Harambee Youth Accelerator, we were able we enabled them to further expand the electronic platform, and in that way they were able to reach more than 600,000 young people who could register on the platform. I think what was useful about this platform is that today, through Jobs Fund support and other support, this platform now provides the foundation building block for the SA Youth Mobi, where young people can sign on SA Youth Mobi, where they can receive psychosocial support, where they can receive opportunities for education and general guidance. So that is working with youth and ensuring that youth are ready for the labor market, but more importantly that they're also connected with the labor market through active intermediation. So it's not just training for the sake of training, but demand-led training. Another aspect of our work is working with in the informal sector and working with spaza shop owners. So these spaza shop owners during the lockdown, of course, they were quite adversely affected because of their cash flow issues. Through the support that we made available, the spaza shop owners, and this is more than 3,000 spaza shops that we were supporting at the time, were able to continue their operations. Another place where we intervened was in microfinance. So we have a project called Pakamani, and they make microloans available to primarily women. Again, of course, the impact there, we know the disproportionate impact of COVID on women. Through the support, in the cash flow support, we were able to ensure that these small businesses, micro businesses, were able to continue to operate. That they were able to continue to buy stock and sell and run their businesses. And I think that we had a similar intervention in the agriculture sector, where our emerging farmers were feeling the impact because of the lockdown. Again, cash flow constraints, and so assisting those farmers to continue, to be able to obtain their farming inputs. So those are a few practical examples of how we intervened during the lockdown. Lisa.
Thanks so much, Najwa. There were a couple of raised hands that subsequently were lowered, but I'd like to invite those who did raise their hands to please just ask their question now, if they're still wanting to do so. Please go ahead, Luazi and Sasha.
No, I'm not. Hello, am I audible now?
Yes.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you to Anandra for those answers. I think I'd like to. Well, firstly, I'd like to find out because from our perspective, one of the issues that we are dealing with in the AU Commission on COVID-19 is the socioeconomic recovery, both during COVID and post-COVID. So it would be very good to know where we can track the impact of these interventions, because one of the things that worried the commissioners is that there have been a lot of interventions, and yet we are still seeing not poor, but worsening outcomes in terms of poverty, food insecurity, income insecurity, etc. And so one of the things that they want to do is that they actually want to now really critically study all of these various interventions to see really what is the true impact and in what ways there maybe needs to be amendments to ensure that the impact is actually meaningful. So I'd like to know where we can track the outcomes of these interventions. But then number two, I'd just like to come back to the question that was posed, and I'd just like to push a little bit further on that question. And it's a question actually that I've raised and a number of participants have raised across various discussions. And this is the question of the informal sector. And I'd really like to know what can be done to rapidly elevate them into a space where they are visible, as Prof. Miracle said. And if we haven't done much in the country because for whatever reasons, what can we learn then from other regions in terms of formalizing to the extent that they are able to meaningfully participate in the stimulus packages that are offered by government. I'm still not getting clear, concrete examples that I can maybe take back to the commissioners and start to, where we can actually at least make a start in the various regions on the continent. So if I could just be helped out on that one. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask Sasha Knox to ask a question first before I ask others to answer, just so that we can conclude them, because we're heading out of time quite soon. So I'd like to get the questions answered. Thanks. Please go ahead, Sasha.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, I had popped questions in the Q&A, but I'm not sure that was being monitored, although there have been some responses. I just wanted to maybe ask the questions that I popped there. Can you please give some more information on the initiatives to tackle structural causes of employment? What was undertaken under this area and what were the impacts? And then I had asked as well, how does the job fund, justify investment in short-term jobs when unemployment in this country is structural, chronic, and intergenerational? Thanks.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask Najwa and then Miracle to firstly answer the first set of questions. And then also, if we run out of time, please, Haroon, I think one of those questions you might be able to answer of Sasha Knox's. If you can in the Q&A, please do so. Otherwise, I'll also allow an open floor for that. Thanks. Please go ahead, Najwa.
Thank you, Riza, and thank you for the questions. I think to start with the last one about how do we justify short-term jobs in the context of structural unemployment. I don't think, Sasha, it's a question of being able to justify short-term jobs. I've demonstrated the kind of continuum of actions that government is taking currently. And where it comes to, the issue of the structural causes of unemployment, that is not the space in which the Jobs Fund plays. However, in respect of short-term jobs, when we started with the Jobs Fund, as I said, we were looking at sustainable employment solutions, right? So in order for us to register that a job had been created, we actually asked our project partners to provide us with evidence of employment contracts. And these employment contracts had to go beyond a 12-month period. And of course, it wasn't an internship either. But what we have seen is that there is a change in the labor market, and employers are unwilling to issue those types of contracts. So what we have done instead is to try and create a stickiness in the labor market. So we track the short-term jobs. So employers are willing to come on board and say, we'll give the person a 3-month job, and then we will give them another 3 months, and so forth. So what we are actually doing now is tracking at an individual basis that that an individual was employed for a period longer than 12 months. Also, in some of the models, the employment models that we have experimented with, we have found that by getting young people and others into a short-term job initially, it starts signaling, it's a useful signal to employers about employability and a whole range of other things. So we have found that taking young people through having short-term jobs and then eventually graduating them into longer-term jobs has been a way of getting young people into the labor market, where they are now able to satisfy the type of signals that the labor market is looking for. And again, I use Harambee as an example, where it's been a very successful program of bridging young people, getting them kind of on the job opportunities, working at short-term contracts, and then being in that way being exposed to employers, and then employers coming on board and being willing to offer longer-term contracts. So it really is a process there. So I think
sorry, Najwa, I think we are sort of running out of time.
Okay.
I just want to give Miracle a chance to respond also on the informal sector. I think, guys, we're going to have to call it quits there because the next session is starting in 8 minutes. So Miracle, perhaps you want to close off for us, and then could I please ask that anyone who can answer the questions in the Q&A of our panel, please do so. Thanks. Go ahead, Miracle.
Thanks, Riza. I just want to start by saying that the informal sector is too diverse. So to say we can have a one answer fit all kind of a solution for them to be regulated, it would be a bit problematic. So I think within localities, maybe there can be some bit of sector specific centers which can be put in place to sort of provide advice and some bit of contracts to individuals who will be dealing within a particular niche of that industry. And if there's that contractual arrangement that can be made and some bit of support in terms of skills and marketing and everything, I'm sure that can be an incentive for individuals in the informal sector to want to be attached to a particular sector that can control them. And I think that can also be helped by giving some financial support when necessary and trying to track those participants to see if they are growing and if there are any bottlenecks in their operations. Maybe that can be an incentive enough for them to kind of be attached and be counted so that they'll be visible over time.
Thanks, Miracle.
Yeah.
I think that your point is actually quite a relevant one, not just for today, but the fact is that historically, some of the sectoral education and training authorities had a mandate to, in fact, try and implement support mechanisms, both for the unemployed as well as micro enterprises in some of those sectors. And it was always a struggle to do so because of the diffuse nature of the informal sector, even within some of the more sectorally specific mandates. I think that there's clearly still a challenge in this respect. Guys, we must call it quits at this point. The next session starts in 5 minutes at 11:45. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the presenters. I'm glad we had a substantial amount of time for chats and discussions, and I hope to see you in the next session. Thanks very much. And I'm going to I can't see the arrow.